My name is Stephen Langa, and I'm the Executive Director of Family Life Network. And as a nation, we are facing a challenge. We are at crossroads as a nation. There's early or child marriages still taking place. We have HIV increasing among the young people. We see a lot of family breakdown, separation, and divorces taking place in the country. We cannot continue business as usual with this happening. Now, we are aware that there are different efforts that are coming to address this matter, and one of them is the National Sexuality Education Framework, which is coming to try and deal with the issue of teenage pregnancy, HIV, and other STDs among our children. And we commend those efforts. However, the big question is, will this really solve the problem? Will it answer? Will it give the solution? Will it take us out of the woods, as the expression says, to bring us to a place where we will be safe and secure as families and as a nation? Well, we will have that discussion. And today, we have organized a meeting for our members of parliament, and we have an expert who is coming to address them on this very important subject of sex or sexuality education. Her name is called Audrey, actually Professor Audrey Werner. Professor Audrey Werner, first of all, was among the first lot that went through comprehensive sexuality education or sex education in America. She went ahead and became a nurse, and she was trained in teaching comprehensive sexuality education herself, and she taught it for a number of years. Later, she was involved in HIV counseling clinic and saw what was happening there. And after seeing what's going on there, she decided to do a research and find out what really happened. Where did this sex or sexuality education come from? And today, she's going to share with us her research findings and share with our members of parliament so that we can know better whether what we are getting into is going to help us or whether we need to take caution and do something else. Audrey, please come and make the presentation to this audience. Let's give her a hand clap.
Thank you so much for coming. It is truly my honor to be standing before you. I am the Dean of Life Issues at Masters International University of Divinity, and I am also a professor there. I teach a course called Restoring Biblical Purity in the Church to pastors all over the world. I have a heart for purity, and I have a heart for protecting our children. And the Lord has led me along the way, and as I said, I am so honored to be here today. My talk is called Getting to the Root of the Problem. If you look at this tree, I'm going to expose the root to you today. But if you think of the trunk as the legislative branch of your government, this is the legislative branch of our government. And our laws were changed dramatically over the last 60, 70 years. And I'm going to share with you what was behind that. And it was done by the American Law Institute Model Penal Code. We threw out God's law and we brought in these man-made laws, and it has been disastrous in America. And then what kind of branches do we have from that tree? Well, we have pornography now, or obscenity, which is legal. We have sex education, which is really childhood pornography that is now legal in our country. We have abortion, of course, that is legal in our country. Abduction and seduction. We now have a problem with child sex trafficking that we never had before. Child sex abuse has exploded in America. We also have rape and incest going on in America. So we're in a bad way. So my goal is to share this information with you so that you don't go down the same dark path that we have gone down. My starting point for this is I used to be a sex educator. I was the school nurse who went into the schools and taught the children about sex. And as a sex educator in our country, you have to go through a standardized training, which I went through. And in that training, they told us, if you go in and talk to kids about sex, you're going to decrease the pregnancy and the STD rate. And I thought to myself at that time, I was newly married and I had no children, and I thought, well, I want to help parents out, so I will do that. And they also told us parents aren't doing their job, so you need to go in there and do it for them. I did that for 5 years, and the Lord blessed us with our very first child, and then I wanted to work part-time for the health department, but the only part-time job available was working in the venereal disease HIV clinic. I thought, I really don't want to do general exams on people, but if I get to work part-time, stay with the health department, and be home with my baby more, then I'll do that. And I did, and it's as if the Lord said, I want you to see the fruit of your labor, because I saw things getting progressively worse. And I thought to myself, where did this come from? Where did sex education come from? Who developed it, and what was the intent behind it? Has it always been around? So I had to answer those questions. And then what happened is, as I started to do the research, then our firstborn child was about to enter a Lutheran school where they taught a Christian sex education program that I actually went through in 1970. And I will share with you that as a little child, I was in 3rd grade, which is about 9 years old. And I remember them giving me the book. And I remember as a child feeling uncomfortable because there were pictures of naked people in that book. And I felt uncomfortable with that book. So I took it and I put it in my desk, and I put it at the farthest point away from me that I could get it. And luckily my teacher was also very uncomfortable with that book. So she didn't even teach it. So praise God, I didn't have to be exposed to it. But as a child, I thought that's real. Now that I think back, that's really interesting, that I was trying to protect my own moral innocence as a child. And so now my son is entering the same Lutheran school where they're teaching this Christian sex education program. And I thought, I've really got to start to really dig into this. So I am sharing with you 20 years of research on sex education. I want to share with you, I worked in the venereal disease clinic from 1991 to 1999. What I witnessed is that children were becoming sexually active sooner. I would say in 1991, we already had sex ed in the schools for since the 1960s. So already we were seeing that children were sexually active. A typical sexual age of first sexual contact was not uncommon to hear 16 or 17. By the time I left in 1999, it was not uncommon to hear 10 years old. Now, I'm not saying that was consensual, but children were becoming more and more sexually active at younger and younger ages. Believe it or not, back in 1991, there still was some shame and guilt associated with having sex outside of marriage. By 1999, there was absolutely no shame and guilt. As a matter of fact, it was celebrated. Date rape dramatically increased in the mid-1990s, and I never understood that till I saw a documentary on pornography. And in it, it shared that during President Clinton's administration, a lot of restrictions had been taken off the porn industry, and that was the first time it really exploded. Now with the internet, it has very much more exploded. So during the early 1990s, there was much more access to pornography. And in pornography, the theme is usually man is the predator and woman is the prey. Our young men were learning that, and date rape dramatically exploded. Now this is something, obviously it's an underreported crime, but in the STD HIV clinic, we saw the results of porn on our society. And I will tell you that different individual states in America are now declaring that pornography has created a public health crisis. Also, what I witnessed was when I began in 1991, I was only telling gay men that they were HIV positive. by the time in 1999 I was telling young teen girls that they were HIV positive. We have something called court order HIV tests, which is if someone is accused of rape, the potential, the alleged victim, it can get the results. That is a mandatory HIV test that they have to get done. In our clinic, HIV results are so confidential you cannot share that with anyone. However, if the person is found guilty of the crime, that is the one time you can share the results with the victim. When I started this, we were doing this test on adult men. By the time I left, we were doing this test on 10-year-old children who had raped 2- and 4-year-old children. So clearly, and I think my husband was a youth and family life director at our Lutheran church, and he was seeing, as I was seeing, there was no difference between the Christian teenager and the non-Christian teenager. So clearly there was a problem, and this was not the results that I had expected. So as I started to look at sex education, you have to think of it as the tip of a mountain above clouds. When you look at the tip and you think, gosh, there must not be that much below, but then when you go below the clouds, gosh, a mile down this mountain goes. And that's exactly what sex education is like. When you're starting to research sex education, it becomes much bigger after that. Sex education is really, we call it the tip of an iceberg, but think about that mountain. Sex education came out of the sexual revolution. We never did sex education with children ever before that. And if we look at the sexual revolution, revolutions don't just occur, they take revolutionaries years of pre-planning. Well, if you go even further, well, who funded that? Well, a lot of the wealthy elite who had foundations are the ones who funded the sexual revolution and ultimately sex education. And our institutions began to change. The institution of education, of medicine, of military, and of the ministry began to change because of this influence. And then ultimately, there was a plan to shift a Christian nation away from God. And of course, if we look to the beginning of time with Adam and Eve, good versus evil has been going on since then. So America is a Christian nation, question mark. We have a picture of George Washington kneeling and praying to God. And then we have our last president, President Obama, who celebrated the homosexual gay marriage ruling of the Supreme Court. So the question is, are we a Christian nation? Well, yes, we are, but we're not a Christian nation because we have more Christians or more churches. We are a Christian nation because our laws and our government were founded on the principles of the Old and New Testament. Law means fixed in every language. It doesn't change. God's law never changes. But if you go to the basement of our Justice Department in Washington, D.C., you'll look at historically all of our laws since the beginning of our nation, going back to the 13 colonies. And those laws have biblical sites that go back to Deuteronomy and Exodus. If you look at the laws 100 years later, the laws are still there, there just isn't a biblical site to it. And if you look to all 50 state laws, they go back to the 10 Commandments. I always say to audiences, whether you're a Christian or not, you want to live in a Christian nation because that's where you're going to obtain freedom and liberty, is in a Christian nation. Non-Christian nations, you will not. So as I said, there's nothing new under the sun. Psalms 2:2 talks about the kings of the earth that set themselves and take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bands asunder and cast away the cords from us. So let me talk about the wealthy elite in America that set out to be the kings of the world. John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and Henry Ford. They established tax-exempt foundations in the 1920s and 30s. Now, these tax-exempt foundations, normally in America, if you have a business, you are accountable to the government. Foundations aren't accountable in terms of how they spend their money. And so these foundations, I will say, yes, they were doing some good things in America, We have some beautiful national parks thanks to our foundations, but behind our backs, they were doing some bad things. And for example, Carnegie was funding the rewriting of American history in the children's textbooks. I have a history book that was written in 1897 that talks about the beginnings of America, and constantly the reference throughout the book is to God's divine providence. God had his hand upon the founders of our nation, and the stories and the miracles that occurred are told in this history book. The Carnegie Foundation came in and developed the American Historical Society and went in and took out all reference to God out of our history books. Then the Rockefeller Foundation funded Margaret Sanger, who is the founder of Planned Parenthood, who believed in eugenics and eliminating the black population in America. The Rockefellers also funded the American Law Institute, which had an intent. They were founded in 1923, and they had an intent to remove 52 Bible-based laws that once protected marriage, women, and children. Then they also, the Rockefeller Foundation funded a guy by the name of Alfred Kinsey, who, when I went through my nursing training, I had never heard of him before. Well, believe it or not, our Congress did an investigation in the 1950s, because already the morality of America in 1950 was starting to shift. We were becoming more immoral. And one of the committees that looked into the Rockefeller-Kinsey connection determined that these Alfred Kinsey's science had been used to deliberately attack the Judeo-Christian morality in America. Well, you ask yourself, why would the wealthy elite want to remove God from our laws, from America? Well, if you look historically to other nations, when God's removed, what happens? There's a lot of immorality. What happens when there's immorality? Well, a wealthy elite, just a few in the government, come in and take over and rule. Hence, you have socialism, which moves toward communism. And our next election, we already have people who deeply believe in communism that want to be a part of being the president of the United States. And we never had that before. One of the signers, one of the dearest documents we have to the founding of our nation is the Declaration of Independence. One of the signers of our Declaration of Independence knew morality is a national security. Forget about the terrorists. Morality is a much worse national security. He said, a general disillusion of principles and manners will more surely overthrow the liberties of America than the whole force of the common enemy. While the people are virtuous, they cannot be subdued. But when once they lose their virtue, they'll be ready to surrender their liberties to the first external or internal invader. One of our state representatives, he was from Idaho, and he wondered, he was looking at we have primarily two political parties. We have the Republican Party, which tends to be the more conservative, and we have the Democratic Party, which tends to be the more liberal. He asked the question because what's happening is our Republican Party was moving toward the middle, and our Democratic Party was moving toward communism. And so he wanted to find out why was that happening, and he actually found out that there were three groups that are influencing America with the intent of eliminating Christianity and ushering in communism. The Fabian Society, the Communist Party USA, and the Frankfurt School from Germany. Now, the Frankfurt School had a brilliant idea: infiltrate the church, because if they could infiltrate the church is the one that sets the standard in the country. So the question is, how do you shift a Christian nation away from God? Well, if we look to Scripture, sexual immorality is usually how people failed. So in America, they aim the attack at men because men are the protectors and the head of their family. So pornography became legal in the 1950s. You need to aim it at marriages because that's the foundation of the family. It wasn't same-sex marriage that destroyed marriage in America. It was way back when we took out the law. It used to be against the law to have sex outside of marriage, and we took that law away. And then we had a new law come in called no-fault divorce. It used to be till death do us part. But this law came in and said, no, you can divorce whenever you want, for whatever reason. And then you have to aim the attack at children. Hence, we have the legalization of sex education. So let me talk briefly about Alfred Kinsey. He was considered the father of the sexual revolution. He did sex studies in the 1930s and 40s, and his studies were published in 1948. They came out with Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. In 1953, they came out with Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. He claimed to have scientifically proven what was normal human sexuality, and laws and public policies in America were changed based on his authority. So who was this guy that had so much influence? He was a zoologist at Indiana University. The Kinsey Institute is still there today. He studied the sexual behavior of the gall wasp, and he was an evolutionist, so he believed there's no difference between a gall wasp and a human. We're all animals. The media portrayed him as a happily married man with children, but he was a homosexual sadomasochist, and he advocated for all sexual rights. He felt there should be no limits to what anyone wanted to do. What's most disturbing is when he gathered his data. Usually a scientist gathers objective data when he is doing his studies. This man went into the prisons and sought out the most sexually deviant criminals, men, and said, this is the typical sexual behavior of the American male. He interviewed prostitutes who had lived with a man for more than a year. Now, back then, that was against the law. And he interviewed them, and he said, this is the typical sexual behavior of the married American female. And I'm going to talk in a minute about the childhood data. But he was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and eventually by American tax dollars. This is a picture of Dr. Judith Reisman. She is the #1 expert on Kinsey in the world. And she, a couple of years ago, went to Croatia and did this type of presentation, and they got sex education out of their country. On the left is a page out of Kinsey's book from 1948, and it is table 34. In that, it documents how many orgasms does a child have, some of them over a 24-hour period of time, beginning at ages 5 months up through the age of 14. If you wrap your head around that, that means an adult was raping a child or a baby over a 24-hour period of time. From that, he concluded that children are sexual from birth, and that is the root of sex education. Kinsey died in the late 1950s, but some of his associates lived on. He was on one of our famous talk shows, some of the associates, with Judith Reisman sitting next to them. And when the host of the talk show saw table 34, he was just stunned. And he said, wait a minute. He said, did he interview pedophiles? To which Kinsey's associate, Clarence Tripp, said, oh, he listened to only pedophiles who were very careful, used stopwatches, knew how to record their thing. Now, in Kinsey's book, how does he determine that a baby, a toddler, a young child is having an orgasm? He said, sobbing, sometimes with an abundance of tears, especially among younger children, and afflicted with extreme trembling, collapse, and sometimes fainting. Kinsey also wrote that children enjoy the experience, although many fight away the partner. Not the perpetrator, but the partner. So what was his conclusions from this scientific studies? He determined that all sex laws are broken, so they should be eliminated. When women say no, they really mean yes, so rape isn't harmful, so let's just get rid of those laws. He said sex should be shared with everyone. Now this is interesting. Back then he said all sex experimentation before marriage will increase a long-term successful marriage, and venereal disease will be reduced dramatically. He is the one who said children are sexual from birth. He also said that adult child sex and incest aren't harmful to children at all. He also claimed that everyone's bisexual, with 37% of men being homosexual. That's at the foundation of the LGBTQ movement in America. That's the foundation, this guy. So based on the authority of what Alfred Kinsey said was scientifically verified truth about normal human sexuality, America's profession of law, medicine, education, military, and even the ministry shifted America's founding standard on life and human sexuality. Since I'm talking to the lawmakers, let me talk to you about how Kinsey's report changed American law. Historically, we only have two standards of law in America. We have pre-Kinsey and post-Kinsey. Pre-Kinsey, it was a creational or a generative standard. Our laws were based on the common law, which the authority was the Bible. We had one nation under God. Marriage was defined as mother, father, children. We had the sanctity of marriage, fidelity, purity, monogamy. We had childhood modesty. We had premarital chastity. And sexual violations were punished. And isn't it interesting in America that self-government was possible? Because even our founders knew if we had God's law in place and we did self-government, that would lead to liberty. If we look to after Kinsey's science came out, we shifted to a degenerative standard. We have the American Law Institute's Model Penal Code, which is sanctioned on Kinsey's authority. Now we have one nation under government. We have various human groupings, various genders and orientations. We have open marriage and no-fault divorce. We have adultery and free love. We have adult child sex is now looked as positive, and our sex laws against rapists of women and children are being eliminated or weakened. Usually they are therapeutically managed and put out on the street. When you move into a new neighborhood, you immediately go to an app and you find the local pedophile, the person who has been convicted of a sex crime against a child, and you find out where they live. No matter what neighborhood you live in, you're going to find 1, 2 to 20 of them. So Morris Ernst, who was one of the founders of the ACLU, called for the elimination of those 52 laws. Pre-Kinsey, physical intimacy outside of marriage was illegal. Fornication, rape, statutory rape, adultery, sodomy, which was oral or anal sex, bestiality, voyeurism, obscenity, abortion, seduction, crimes against infants or minors, lewd behavior, and contraception were illegal in America. Pre-Kinsey, these 52 laws against such acts protected marriage in American law, built on the Old and New Testament, which considered these acts sin and perversion. Living together, for example, was termed open and notorious cohabitation, and you could serve prison time if you were found guilty because it was considered a threat to the family. The Kinsey report were used by the state commissions and revision committees. They basically said, you know what, our laws are really old and they're out of date, they're not with the times. So we've got this new science, so we need to throw out those old laws and bring in these new laws. So they drafted something called the Model Penal Code in 1955, and Illinois was the first state to adopt it in 1957, and then all the other states followed suit. If you look to their bibliography, you will find that of 197 footnotes, Kinsey is the sole authority on normal human sexual behavior. So prior to 1950, the men were considered protectors and they were considered responsible for their sexual actions. Under the common law, as a protector, they were responsible for those actions. Unmarried sex with any woman was viewed as unprincipled. The only lawful sexual contact in the state codes was the marital act. But here are some of the law. This is an example of a law review, the Vanderbilt Law Review, and they influenced the changing of the law. This is what they said based on Kinsey's science. The sometimes extreme seductiveness of a young female is a factor which has no place in the law, but it certainly affects motivation. Even at the age of 4 or 5, the seductiveness may be so powerful as to overwhelm the adult into committing the offense. The affair is often, therefore, not always the result of the adult's aggression. Often the young female is the initiator and the seducer. A 4-year-old girl, it's her fault that she got raped by an adult man. And that's why we remove these laws. So let me talk about the birth of sex education in America. This is a picture of Kinsey, and if you notice, he's smiling. His wife is over here. I think she's smiling more, and a couple of his associates. All of the members of his team were required to have sex with each other and to have sex men to men, women to women. That was a requirement with his team. If you notice, he is showing these children films of animals copulating over and over and over. And if you notice, only the adults are smiling. The children look pretty horrified. So for those who have a sociology or a behavioral science degree, you've heard of Carl Rogers, Piaget, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Isn't it interesting that prior to 1948, the knowledge of sex was never a primary childhood need. They identified such individual and group skills as learning to reason, submitting to authority, moral thinking, task achievement, self-actualization, mutual cooperation, and social interaction as a childhood primary need. So in order for sex education to come into America, there were 2 primary Supreme Court cases that had to occur first, the Supreme Court being our highest court in the land. In 1962, in Engel versus Vitale, they removed prayer from the public schools. Now they cited to no authority. Usually when they make a decision, they have all these authorities to back them up. They just did it on their own. And then in 1963, they took Bible reading out of the schools. And again, they only cited to one authority, which was the case the year before. So you get God out of the public schools, and it's not by accident in 1964, sex education was put into the schools. The organization was called SIECUS, which is Sex Information Education Council of the United States. They are one of the main leaders to putting sex education not only in American schools, but in schools across the world. It began in 1964, and it was launched at the Kinsey Institute. The objective was to teach humanist ideology, which means anything goes. There was no moral right or wrong. So you don't limit children, you just give them condoms. And that was taught as sex education. Every contributor to SIECUS had ties to humanism, communism, and eugenics, with a few of them tied to the Temple of Understanding, which is at the UN, which is tied to the Lucifer magazine. I don't think it gets any more obvious evil than that. The early leader for SIECUS was Mary Calderon, who was the medical director of Planned Parenthood, with the initial seed money coming from Hugh Hefner. Later, for those that served on curriculum boards for sex education, they were employed by the porn industry, especially Penthouse Forum. Now you ask yourself, why would Planned Parenthood and the porn industry develop sex ed? If you can get a child to be sexually stimulated and she becomes sexually active, guess what's going to happen? She's going to get an abortion, and they're going to make money. If you get a child sexually stimulated and they want to be stimulated more, guess what? They're going to turn to pornography. Hence, this was a brilliant marketing tool on their part. The technique that was used, I've looked at historical books, how do we used to talk to kids, and it was a very modest, indirect way. We did it through the flowers, the birds, and the bees. And what we did is we shifted from God's standard of generations to talking about the act, making sure they know their name of their genitals. And isn't that interesting? Because they don't have to know any other body part when they're little. They just have to know the name of their genitals. Keep focusing on that area. Now, by 1967, they said, we need to have everybody on the same page. We need all educators to be trained on how they are to talk to children about sex. So they developed the American Association of Sex Educators, counselors and therapists, and that was created for the teachers, the school nurses, any helping professional. Their job was to provide information to the sex educator, to train him or her in the psychotherapy technique necessary to communicate this knowledge to others, and to restructure his or her sexual values so as to equip him or her to expand their students' tolerance and acceptance of variant sexual practices and lifestyle. Our children today see homosexuality as normal. They see the transgender as normal. They see transvestites as normal and acceptable, and they're experimenting now in these behaviors. When Roe versus Wade, when abortion was made legal in America, they asked the director of Planned Parenthood and one of the signers of the Humanist Manifesto, Alan Gottmacher, they asked him, how could that Supreme Court case be secured and never be overturned? He answered with only 2 words: sex education. It's interesting in America. I remember in 1991, there was a television show with Ellen DeGeneres, and she's a comedian, and she's funny, and she's kind, and everybody loves her, and God love her. I loved her. I just don't love what she does. But what happened is in her comedy series, it was found out that she was lesbian. And once America found that out, her ratings of her show went down like this. Now, if you watch American television, every single show has a gay character. That's a short period of time that we went from that to that. And this is actually the blueprint for how do you normalize that in your country. This was written by 2 college activists. And what they said was we must target an unbigoted audience, with the most unbigoted audience being children. Sex education in America today now encourages children to experiment with sodomy, bisexuality, homosexuality, and to consider sex with adults. Children in California are now being taught that pedophilia is just another sexual orientation that you can choose. Children in Chicago in 3rd and 4th grade are being taught how to have safe anal sex. We are getting down a very, very dark path. So just briefly, how did it change our culture? This is a book that chronicled how abortion became legal in America. And the first site is actually to Kinsey's science. And then the second site is to Mary Calderon, who was the medical director of Planned Parenthood, who cited to Kinsey. And the American Law Institute then endorsed abortion, and that is why it became legal in America. Hugh Hefner, his Kinsey's science was used to legalize pornography in America. While Kinsey was going into the governments, and he went in governments across the world to share his revolutionary science and to influence laws across the world. And he also went into the universities and talked with the academic elites, persuading them to have classes on human sexuality. Well, Hugh Hefner said Kinsey was the researcher and he was the pamphleteer. So Hefner went to the college students and he persuaded men to abandon love and protection for sex and recreation. Hence, now our young men are playboys and our girls are playgirls. Harry Hay was considered the father of the gay rights movement. He was a communist. He read Kinsey's science and said that it fully supported his lifestyle, so he left his wife and 2 children to be a homosexual and start the Mattachine Society, which is the foundation of the homosexual movement. And this is a picture of him on the top as a young man, and then the picture below is him as an elderly man. As an old man, he is marching for NAMBLA, which is the North American Man-Boy Love Association, which is pushing for the legalization of sex between men and boys. This is a book from that chronicles the propaganda that happened during World War II, but I love the statement. It says, when someone in public life can persuade enough people to act on the assumption that his interpretation is valid, he can so influence the character of the future as to make it consistent with his predictions. So we've embraced this concept that children are sexual from birth and we need to give them sex education. Kinsey's science is what was used to change our persona. Based on the data that was gathered by a man who interviewed pedophiles who raped hundreds of children, this has changed how educators view children because now they feel they need to teach these sex education classes. How parents view children. Even parents today are going, gosh, I know gotta give this talk. Parents before Kinsey never thought that way before. It's changed how medical personnel view children. One of my aha moments was working in the STD clinic, and a 22-year-old man brought in a 13-year-old girl who looked like she was 10 years old. I truly believe they lied on the age. But she came in to get birth control, and she was just starry-eyed in love, and she was getting a Depo-Provera shot. And I thought, I can't call anybody about this. I can't call her parent. I can't call the police, because she's considered a consenting adult. And the government will provide condoms and birth control for consenting adults in America. And from state to state, it varies on ages, but with the federal government and our programs, we are giving this to very young children. It's also changed how legislators view children. Obviously, all of these laws based on Kinsey were put in place. And it's even changed how the church views children. I looked at a majority of the Christian sex ed material. The Lutheran Church may have been the first to develop one in 1967, but all the other churches followed suit after that. And what I found is in their bibliographies, Kinsey and his associates. So we are children. I always say to parents today, we're children of the sexual revolution. We've been born into the middle of this, so we know no different. So what happened after 1964 when we applied that sexual attitude restructuring to children? These are national statistics. This is sexually transmitted disease, gonorrhea, ages 10 to 14. Do you notice here we have 62, 63, 64, and then we take off. This is birth rate for unwed girls 15 to 19 years of age. Again, 62, 63, 64, and we take off. Once abortion became legal, they factored that in as well. This is for pregnancies to unwed girls under 15 years of age. And again, you see where this takes off. So what happened to the American family once we started to sexualize kids? It fell apart. It fell apart. Single parent, female had no spouse present. Child sex abuse has exploded. The statistics are something like 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys are going to be molested and raped at some point in their life. Here's a statistic we didn't even have to keep track of before because it wasn't a problem. In-school rapes have exploded. So going back to this documentary on communism in America, Joseph Stalin, the head of the communist movement in Russia, said that America is like its healthy body and its resistance is threefold. It's patriotism, it's morality, and it's spiritual life. If we can undermine these 3 areas, America will collapse from within. I like the statement in the movie. It says, it ain't over till the fat lady sings, and right now she's clearing her pipes. So the walls are down in America. Protections for marriage, women, and children have been eliminated. It's time to take back lost ground. One of the people who mentored me on top of Dr. Judith Reisman, the #1 expert on Kinsey, is Colonel Ron Ray, who's the former assistant to the Secretary of Defense under the Reagan administration. And he is a constitutional lawyer. And he said, Audrey, he's also a retired Marine. He said, Audrey, battles are won because of the ground the leaders decide to take. We are losing these battles in America because we've been taking the wrong ground. So here's the good news. I always say to my friends, God said he would save Sodom for 10 And I know at least 10 righteous people in America, so we're still good. We're still good. But the second president of the United States, John Adams, said, no matter how heedless, insensate, materialistic, selfish, greedy a society may be, if there can be found in it a few clear and powerful voices that speak out unafraid against its corruption, the spirit and the hope of reform can persist. Judith Reisman, she snuck into a celebration from the Kinsey Institute. In 1998, they celebrated at that point how much damage, basically, they had done to America, how much they had accomplished using Kinsey science in America. So if you can imagine the world-leading pedophiles, pornographers, abortionists coming together to celebrate. And the director of the Kinsey Institute, Dr. John Bancroft, got up to the podium and he said, wait a minute, we have a problem. And he complained about Yorkshire television because anything that's been done on Kinsey in America holds him up on a pedestal as a pioneer who had to go through so much difficulty, but thank goodness he's given us this wonderful science. That's all we see in America, and that's all we hear on the universities. But Yorkshire Television came over and did a documentary on him, and it's called Kinsey's Pedophiles. And if you go to YouTube, it's on there. You can find it, but it's never been aired in America. And so Dr. Bancroft was complaining about this. And then he said, and this Judith Reisman, to which Judith hides behind her program a little bit more. And he looked at that crowd, those abortionists, those pornographers, those LGBT activists, and he said, you don't realize if this gets out there, we could lose everything we gained in the last 50 years. Even they know that their root of this tree is really, really weak. I met Judith Reisman and Colonel Ron Ray through a campaign that was done from 1995 to 2004. It was called RSVP America, which stands for Restoring Social Virtue and Purity to America. And their goal was to get it out there, the truth about Kinsey science, and to wake up legislators to where this came from. And they were successful in getting that out. But what happened was and I went to a training that they had in 2003, actually back to 2001. I went to the first training in 2001. There were only 25 of us, 25 Americans in a room who had vowed that we are going to get this information out there, the truth out there. And what happened is by 2004, Hollywood came out with a movie called Kinsey. Well, the question is, why have a movie on Kinsey? Because so far, everything's been done behind the American people's back. So why bring him to the limelight? Because of what 25 people had done over that few-year period of time, Hollywood was starting to get nervous. So they came out with a movie, which of course also showed how wonderful Kinsey was and how great his science was. So it only takes a few. As Stephen had mentioned, Sharon Slater, who is with Family Watch International at the UN, she and I are part of an organization called Protect Child Health Coalition. And if you go to the stopcse.org, Sharon has put together a wonderful film. You can choose the 5-minute film or the 30-minute film, talking about how sex education is being pushed on the countries in South America and in Africa and what's happening in the United States. My ministry, I started a group called the Matthew 18 group, which is based on Matthew 18, 15 to 17. If your brother's sinning, you go to him. If they don't listen, you go with someone else. If that doesn't work, you take it to the church. Well, I found that the Lutheran Church was in error, that this Lutheran sex ed program was based on Kinsey, so I knew I needed to use that process. So that's been my ministry, is going to the churches and going to the pastors and waking them up to the resources that they are using, which is based on Kinsey, and encouraging them to go back to biblical purity. I had no intent of speaking to anybody in government. However, in the state, I live in the state of Texas. And in the state of Texas, we have some of, there is horrific graphic sex ed that is being pushed for our kids. This is a book called It's Perfectly Normal, which is a book that's given to children in kindergarten. And if you open up the book, it's got these cute cartoon characters on the front there, but if you open the book, it shows you a man and a woman having sex. It shows you a man and a man having sex. It shows how to masturbate. And so I was asked to go speak to all of our pro-life and pro-family leaders in the state of Texas, and I did. And they started to take this book. They started sharing it with some of the legislators and just putting it in their faces, and they were horrified. So the Republican convention actually made the Republican convention, they made a resolution to get sex education out of the state of Texas. Right now in America, there are 44, the way they got sex ed in, because we used to have obscenity laws. You cannot show pornography to children. You will serve prison time if you are showing pornography to children. However, they made an exemption. If a child is in a school, you can show them obscenity. If a child is in a library, you can show them obscenity. So 44 out of our 50 states have these laws. So we are now working on having those laws removed. Sex is a funny word is now being shown to preschoolers in America. This book, if you open it up, it tells the children that if you're a boy, if you don't feel like being a boy, you can be a girl. If you're a girl, you don't feel like being a girl, you can be a boy. Start to plant those seeds. We have children in America as young as 8 years old, boys that are taking estrogen to become girls, and girls taking testosterone to become boys. Once they become teenagers, if they want to cut off their breasts or cut off their genitals to transition, they are doing it, and the government is supporting it, and above the objective of parents. Parents are losing their authority in this area. This is a boy who is 8 years old. He's a transgender youth, and he is being promoted in the country. He was on Good Morning America, which is one of our popular morning shows. And the problem is, the scientific community, the true scientists, the true physicians who know medicine have said that medicine is now no longer medical, it is turning political. If you go through Biology 101, every cell in your body is either male or female. You can take synthetic hormones and as a boy start to grow breasts, but if you stop taking those hormones, you're going to revert right back to the sex God made you. But yet that's being ignored. And what are the long-term effects of these children using these synthetic hormones on themselves and mutilating themselves? Already in the transgender community, they have an extremely high rate of suicide. What do you think happens after they've mutilated themselves and they're taking these synthetic hormones? It's not helping the problem. Children are being sexualized in America. I give the example, I have 3 boys and 1 girl. And when my daughter turned 8 years old, I had to move from the section in the store where they had the cute toddler, little girl clothes. I had to move on to the girl clothes. And we lived in a suburb of Chicago. It was really hard to find modest clothing for her. We are now dressing up our little girls in seductive clothing. This is becoming huge in America. It's called a drag queen story hour. Men that like to dress up as women are going into the libraries, the public libraries, and they are reading storybooks to the little children. Why? Because they want to start to normalize this. But we had a problem in Houston, Texas. It was found out that the man dressed as a woman who was reading to the children was a convicted pedophile. So we have a lot of problems in America. This is a curriculum put out by Planned Parenthood called Unequal Partners. A school nurse in Chicago gave me this. And what it is a program to train the teacher, the school nurse, the counselor, how to help a young adult, and they define that as 10 to 17 years old, if they're in a sexual relationship. You notice the picture, we have an adult man and a boy. If they're in a sexual relationship, you're not supposed to call the police if a 10-year-old comes to you. You're to help him decide, is that a healthy relationship for him? I'm sorry, but that's all unhealthy. Dr. Meg Meekers wrote the book, Epidemic, How Teen Sex is Killing Our Kids. She said, I believe even more strongly there's a correlation between the explosion of sexual activity and the epidemic of STDs and depression in our teenagers. What I hear and see is that sexual freedom causes most of them tremendous pain. The rates of suicide amongst our kids are going higher and higher and higher. Some of that is related to broken relationships that should have never occurred before marriage. So sex education at its core is evil. It was never designed to decrease pregnancy or STD rates, but rather to prepare children for sex. At the core of sex education is a man who interviewed pedophiles who raped hundreds of children and believes adults should have sex with infants. At the core is Planned Parenthood, which is the #1 provider of Planned Parenthood in the world. And at the core of sex education is the pornography industry. So I want to talk briefly on action points. When I uncovered all of this, I thought, wow, this is huge. It is huge. I'm only one person. So I encourage you to pray, pray, pray. I am reminded by David and Goliath, by Gideon, several accounts in the Bible. It only takes a few to turn a big train around. This is a global attack on children. And I want to praise you in Uganda. I have to admit, when I was on your university speaking to the faculty and the staff, I was hesitant to even say the word Jesus Christ, because if I did in America, I would be shouted down and yelled at and silenced. But here, you can say that. You have a wonderful country, and I love it. This is a report that was done by Physicians Consortium, and it was done in 2002. It's called Zero Grazing, How Uganda's emphasis on fidelity and abstinence is winning the war on HIV and AIDS. And they attributed to the fact that the president of Uganda, from the top on down, was calling for abstinence and fidelity. And that's why your AIDS, HIV rates went down, 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 when none of the other African countries had that type of results. It's huge when we tell children to wait until marriage. Then in America, of course, we are telling people to contact their government leaders. Even parents now are going to the state capitol and taking those books from their children's schools and putting them in their faces to go, look at this. This is what my child is getting. I just got an email a couple of days ago from a woman in Phoenix, Arizona. She took table 34 and blew it up and went to her school board meeting because they were about to put very graphic sex ed in there, and she took 70 parents with her, and they ended up not putting that sex ed program in there. We have got to start to wake up to these issues. I have an opportunity to present to our Texas legislators. We had a briefing in January, and then I came back and testified for a bill to get rid of that obscenity exemption in Texas, and it's still in the works right now. Third thing we need to do is we need to educate parents. Parents need to be the primary educator in this area. The reason parents are uncomfortable with talking to their kids about sex is because Judith Reisman told me, she said, Audrey, when we talk to kids about sex, we sexualize them to adults, to each other, and to themselves. And I thought to myself, well, bingo. The Holy Spirit never intended for us to sexualize our kids. Hence, that's why we feel so uncomfortable talking graphically to them. If parents encourage their children to wait until marriage, that is the most powerful influence that a child will have. Parents have the task of preparing, and sadly in this world, of also having to protect their children. But I've also suggested that churches need to step up and train parents on how they can talk to their children and encourage them to live pure lives. The anything goes standard that is taught in the schools now, or kids are going to be sexually active anyway, so let's give them condoms and birth control, has been disastrous in America. I did not want to write a book, but as I said, I looked at 90% of the Christian materials had Kinsey in it, so I knew I had to say something. So I wrote a book called 10 Tips on How Not to Talk to Your Kids About Sex, where I expose where sex ed came from, what it's done to the children in America, and then I encourage them, I give them 10 biblical principles. And parents can convey God's life process. As I said, I looked at antique books, and it was beautiful how they communicated it back then. They would talk about the flower, and the mommy part, the daddy part, the two parts come together, and a baby's formed. That's how it is with you. And you tell your toddler or preschool that, and then you've given them a foundation for that information. And then you build upon that, and then they know you're the one that they should come back to, and they're the one you should talk to. As I said, churches need to train how to teach children about purity and social virtue. The only way sex education can be eliminated is when parents, educators, governments, leaders, and church leaders no longer look at kids through Kinsey's eyes and start looking at them through Jesus' eyes. Children need to be protected and not sexualized. Let's let children be children for as long as possible. Good friends of mine, Gary and Anne-Marie Ezzo, they wrote Growing Kids God's Way and Baby Wise parenting material. They're in 95 countries, and when I was at Toto's church yesterday, one of the pastors came up and said that they taught their curriculum. But they have a curriculum called Protecting the Innocence of Childhood. And what that curriculum does is trains parents on how to teach their children chastity, purity, modesty, and self-control. And I love the statement in here that Gary Ezzo said. Childhood innocence is what keeps a child in childhood. Remove the innate innocence of childhood, and you've removed the essence of childhood. In our 35 plus years of parent education, we've come to realize that nothing assaults childhood innocence faster and with more destructive influence than providing children with inappropriate sex knowledge before they are developmentally ready to emotionally, intellectually, and morally manage such knowledge. I say that's very, very well said. So let me share. There's a difference between, in America, what's happened is, in the coalition I'm in, half of us are saying we need to get this out of the schools, sex ed out of the schools, and we need to give it back to the parents. And we need to train them how to teach biblical purity to their kids. The other half of the group saying we need to take sex education out and we need to put abstinence education in. But the problem with that is some of our abstinence educators are turning into sex educators. What they're basically doing is they're going in, they're talking to the kids about sex, but they're saying, after they've talked about it, then they say, but wait until marriage. And so those programs are doing better than the sex ed programs, but they're not what God has for us, God's best. So we taught our children biblical purity. I have 3 adult children, and then I have my baby is 15 years old, and he's now taller than me. And we have taught our children that God has a plan for your life. He has given you gifts and skills and talents. We will help you find out what God wants you to do, but you are to do it for His glory. And then God at some point is going to bring your husband or wife to you. But in the meantime, you are to wait until marriage. So my oldest son is in the U.S. Coast Guard, and this picture on the left is him in the Persian Gulf. And always he was the lone virgin on his ship. The American soldiers are being bombarded with pornography. He finds at all the bases pornography. There are brothels usually outside of the bases for the soldiers. So he would get teased horribly for being the lone virgin on his ship, but he stood his ground. And afterwards, some of the guys came up to him and said, you know, I wish I would have waited, and I really admire your self-control. So it became a ministry for him, and he began to set out the example. So he's now assigned up to Kodiak, Alaska, which is a very tiny island, not the mainland of Alaska, but a tiny island with a base and a little tiny town. And I said, you know, the odds of you finding her up there are pretty slim, so just wait till you get back down to the lower 48. Well, who am I to question when God brings two people together? Because when he was up there, after 3 months, he found a lovely Christian young lady who had remained pure. And so he courted her. He didn't date her, but he courted her with the intention of marriage, which her father loved. And then they got married, and a year after, they had our first grandbaby, a baby girl. So now I'm a grandma. And the neat thing was, on their wedding day, Blake snuck into the bridal lounge, didn't look at her, because that's tradition. You don't look at the bride before she comes down the aisle. Reached around and prayed a blessing over their marriage. But unbeknownst to me, when he was 19 years old, when he was going into the military, he wrote a letter to his future spouse. And in that letter, he promised to remain pure and to wait for her. And he said, if I'm reading this letter, I have been successful in God helping me find you. But then he went on to say, but the things I can't wait to do, I want to share. And the first thing he said, as a protector, as a warrior for the Lord, I cannot wait to protect you. And then he went through all the characteristics of a godly husband. And at the very end, he said, and I can't wait to be in the delivery room with you. And I tell you, for a mom who has a purity ministry, I'm in the audience going, yes, this does work. We can raise pure kids in today's culture. And I'll tell you, there wasn't a dry eye in the place. Everybody had tears in their eyes when he read that letter. This is a book called The Global Sexual Revolution, Destruction of Freedom in the Name of Freedom. Basically, what it is saying is that a person who's rooted in religion and family is hard to manipulate. Sexualization actually blinds people and makes them unwilling to resist attacks on the fundamental pillars of society's value system, such as the legalization of abortion and homosexual marriage. It's interesting, in the 1971, the Time of Your Life series came out, sex education series, and in it was teaching children, by the year 2000, fathers will no longer have a place in the home, and there will be no more organized religion. Why would they say that to children in a sex ed program? Because that's the intent behind sex education. Weaken the family, destroy the church. So that is my presentation. Thank you so much for coming and for listening. I can take any questions if you have any questions. This is my contact information. My book is on Amazon, and I have a ministry website that has a lot of this information that I shared with you as well.
That's not good enough. Can you please